Okay.
Okay, it's going on. It's by Paul and Giancarlo. Two guys who helped the most during my job market 25 years ago in New Haven. Okay, go ahead, Paul.
So thanks, Janelle. I also want to say thank you to the organizers for rescuing the conference and giving me a chance to present. I also wanted to say that the reorganization of the program to pair me with Mick is fortuitous. It makes sense not only in terms of time zones, but also in terms of topic. And if I have time today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper that Mick referenced because it uses the same model as the paper that I submitted to the conference. So this is joint work with Giancarlo. There we go. And the underlying motivation is a observation of a disconnect in the Keynesian literature. While the traditional Keynesian literature has focused on an ex post currency devaluation with the goal of gaining a short-run price competitive advantage during the time that prices and wages are sticky, the more recent new Keynesian literature focuses instead on a trade-off between output gap and better terms of trade. And so it often turns out to be optimal in these models for policymakers to try to pursue a real appreciation to improve their terms of trade, even though that seems to be the opposite of the desire to gain competitiveness. So part of the motivation here is to propose or develop an alternative to the existing new Keynesian approach, in addition to the model that allows us to better reflect what we view as the concern among policymakers regarding competitiveness, but still be consistent with the logic and results of the new Keynesian literature. The main idea here is that stabilization policy has asymmetric effects across different sectors, and it affects the long-run comparative advantage over alternative tradable goods. So our model will have two tradable sectors that are different in certain characteristics that distinguish them in their response to monetary policy. So in particular, we're going to have a differentiated goods sector that's characterized by market power, typically identified with manufacturing. And we'll also have a non-differentiated good that's also traded, but is different in that it lacks market power. In the context of the monetary literature, we're familiar with the differentiated goods in terms of their price setting power, which is what justifies discussions of sticky prices. But in the trade literature, it's also associated with an upfront entry cost, which is what justifies the existence of the monopoly profits. They're used to pay that entry cost. So it turns out that this combination of the requirement that these differentiated goods producers have to pre-commit, both in terms of their price setting and in their upfront sunk entry costs, makes them more sensitive to macroeconomic uncertainty regarding the unknown future demand that they're going to face, and makes them benefit more from appropriate monetary stabilization policy. And so appropriate monetary stabilization policy can generate conditions for comparative advantage of these differentiated goods, which has certain welfare benefits. So the presentation today is going to focus on two things. First, the implications of this model for optimal monetary policy in certain cases. First, in response to a standard productivity shock, how to stabilize over that. And secondly, I'd like to, at the end, if I have time, talk about the optimal monetary policy response to tariff shocks or trade war shocks. And that's coming from a second paper that Mick referred to. It uses the same model, so I'm hoping I can squeeze that in at the end. And we think that the model we're using is particularly well suited at talking about tariff shocks and trade wars, because the model, part of its point is it incorporates elements from the trade literature that the trade literature has found important for understanding optimal tariffs, including firm entry and endogenous comparative advantage. But just in case I run short on time, let me just preview what I view as the main results. First, the optimal Ramsey policy in response to the productivity shocks is similar to what we're familiar with in terms of it's optimal to target inflation But in this case, it's the inflation for differentiated goods. That's the sector with the sticky prices. And it makes use of the exchange rate to offset, help offset the sticky price distortion. So that result is familiar from earlier literature with just one sector. Here it applies to the differentiated goods sector. Secondly, when one country commits to an exchange rate peg, it's undesirable in the presence of these productivity shocks. It prevents optimal stabilization. And in this case, it has really large welfare costs potentially because it shifts comparative advantage, specialization away from these differentiated goods towards non-differentiated goods. So in this asymmetric equilibrium between countries, you can get pretty large welfare losses in one country and welfare gains in the other country relative to the Ramsey optimal cooperative policy. In fact, I ran some experiments this week in which I compute an experiment that's similar to one of the things that Mick did is assuming a peg in one country, the other country optimally chooses its monetary policy, and it turns out that it deviates from the inflation targeting regime in particular ways that which serve to the objective seems to be to amplify this shift in comparative advantage of the differentiated goods towards their own country and to disadvantage the foreign country, and that has big welfare effects. Another one of the results I want to emphasize is that in the context of this two traded good model, it's perfectly consistent to talk about policy promoting competitiveness of the manufacturing sector at the same time as improving the overall terms of trade for the consumer price index, because there's a shift in the export weights between the two different sectors from the lower cost, perfectly competitive sector, the non-differentiated sector, towards the differentiated goods sector with their markups. You can have both at the same time. Competitiveness is consistent with terms of trade improvement. And lastly, I want to talk about an extension to consider the same model, an optimal policy also with not productivity shocks, but tariff shocks. And it turns out the optimal policy here uses the exchange rate to help offset the relative price distortions of the tariff. And in some ways, this is similar to some of the cases that Mick looked at in his extremely interesting paper, but it is quite distinct and doesn't consider the optimal tariff story, just looking at the optimal monetary policy, taking the tariffs as given. Okay, let me say just a little bit, highlight just the key elements of the model that are important here. In addition to the two countries, we have two tradable sectors, differentiated indicated by D, non-differentiated by N. Mechanically, you can think of this as combining together a perfectly competitive sector of a Bacchus-Keogh-Kidlin type real business cycle model, along with a monopolistically competitive differentiated goods sector from Oldfield-Rogoff with sticky prices, and putting them both together in one model side by side. So mechanically, it's not terribly new or difficult just putting both together, but it does have some interesting novel implications. Production requires labor and intermediates from the differentiated goods sector that promotes amplification of the effects of price of differentiated goods throughout the economy. And there's productivity is stochastic, and we abstract in this model from firm heterogeneity. There's just heterogeneity between the two sectors. We'll have price stickiness in the form of producer currency pricing as our main case, and the only investment we have is investment in new firm creation at some cost, which many people regard as a type of investment. I probably don't need to say too much about the goods market structure other than there are an endogenous number of firms producing the differentiated goods, represented by N in the home country and N star in the foreign. So when you look at the goods market structure, the consumption bundle combines both differentiated goods and non-differentiated goods, each of a home and a foreign type, but the share of the different home differentiated goods in the bundle depends upon the number of home firms that enter the market and the number of foreign firms that find it profitable to enter the market. Production of the differentiated goods involves not only labor inputs, but also an aggregate of the differentiated goods. And importantly, these firms need to prepay a one-time sunk entry cost, and the benchmark that also is composed of the differentiated goods composite. And we also have trade costs, which turns out to be important for the welfare calculation. So how do firms enter? Well, they compute the value of entering the market. This is firm creation. It's not entry into the export market alone, but it's just simply firm creation. In the benchmark version of the model, all the firms do export, but we've looked at robustness type cases in which firms also choose whether or not to enter the export market separately from the home market. And the entry condition is just firms enter up to the point that the value of entry, the V, equals the sunk entry cost. The non-differentiated sector is completely standard. Production is linear in labor with flexible prices. And the household problem also is completely standard. Intertemporal consumption smoothing, where households have access to both domestic and foreign currency bonds, implying all the usual first order conditions, including a consumption of oil or labor supply and money demand. One thing I probably should define carefully is the fact that we have multiple relative price terms floating around in the model. In addition to the conventionally defined real exchange rate, we also define the terms of trade, the relative price between exports and imports, both the one that's standard in the trade literature, which only focuses on the differentiated goods, or here M for manufacturing terms of trade. That's the terms of trade that the trade literature would tend to focus on. But we think it's also relevant to incorporate the prices of the non-differentiated goods and look at the overall terms of trade as we typically define in the macro literature. And so this is just a weighted average of the price of the differentiated goods and the non-differentiated goods, where the weights omega are just computed in a statistical way as the value of exports in the differentiated sector divided by the total value of the exports in both sectors together. And it turns out that this omega, this share of differentiated goods in your export bundle, is an object of interest that we're going to report in our simulations. It's an indication of how comparative advantage shifts between sectors across countries. Okay, I probably won't say anything about the calibration. It's all standard in the macro literature, aside from calibrating the differentiated goods sector, which we borrow from papers in the trade literature. Okay, let me start by showing some impulse responses. You can see the dynamic response to a 1% rise in home productivity, specifically in the differentiated goods sector. That's the impulse response I am showing here. And there are a couple of just points I want to highlight. One point is I don't report here the dynamics under the flexible price allocation, because under these assumptions, it turns out to be the same as what you get under a rule that targets the differentiated goods inflation. So I'll show that result here. The Ramsey optimal policy turns out to be very similar to the policy of differentiated goods inflation targeting. At least in terms of the interest rates implied by those two cases, you get almost the same thing. Whereas the case of an exchange rate peg, which is the other line you see in the red box, I'll talk about that in a minute, is very different. But the Ramsey and the inflation targeting cases are very similar under these assumptions. So what is the Ramsey optimal response to a home productivity rise in the differentiated goods sector? Well, it's a fairly large rise in home production of the differentiated good, and a rise in the home number of firms in that sector. Whereas you have a fall in the production of home non-differentiated goods and a fall in the foreign counterparts. So fewer home differentiated firms producing fewer home differentiated goods, but the foreign country produces more non-differentiated goods. So that's the Ramsey allocation, or the Ramsey policy. Now, in contrast, if one of the countries pegs, and here I'm just showing the case for comparison where the home country pegs, so I can plot everything on one graph, the results are very different. You can't lower interest rates the same way. You cannot induce the rise in production of home differentiated goods in the way that's efficient. So you're not stabilizing, you're not responding to the shock and it in any way close to the flexible price allocation. You're not able to raise production in the efficient way of the differentiated goods when their productivity goes up. So that it's inefficient stabilization when you have a peg. Now, I thought it might be interesting to look at So what I showed you was the case in which the previous graph was where the home country follows inflation targeting and the foreign country pegs. But I thought, well, suppose the home country takes the foreign peg as given, and the home country can choose whatever policy it wants to maximize its own welfare using inflation as its instrument. So it's a type of Ramsey policy where you're only looking at home welfare. I thought this was kind of perhaps a strange or weird experiment, but I see that Mick actually does something similar. And the result that we got was kind of interesting. In the case of a home productivity shock again, where the foreign country is pegging, it's optimal for the home country to stimulate the economy even more than in the inflation targeting or Ramsey case. So the solid line here is the home unilateral optimal policy, and here is the inflation targeting, which is similar to the Ramsey case. So you're stimulating even more. Why would you do that? That's not typical. It doesn't lead to the usual efficient allocation. You get an even better sense of what's going on when you take a look at a foreign productivity shock and what the optimal home policy is. The home policy raises the domestic interest rate, which forces the foreign country to raise their interest rate, which is the opposite of what the opposite of the Ramsey policy that would lead to the efficient allocation. So it seems that the home country is strategically using its ability to force the hand of the pegging country to pursue policies that are antithetical to efficient stabilization, because that discourages entry of differentiated goods into that foreign country and encourages more firms to enter into the domestic economy, so that the foreign country's loss is the home country's gain. Even more informative than the impulse responses is to look at the effect that these sets of policies have on the unconditional means and then do welfare analysis. As you might have guessed from the impulse responses in my discussion, the benefit, and the first column shows the symmetric Ramsey case. The second column shows the effect of symmetric inflation targeting. Third is the foreign pegs, while the home country uses inflation targeting. And the fourth case is where the home country strategically uses optimal policy against the foreign peg. In these last, I think the interesting cases are the last two columns. And what you see is a significant shift in comparative advantage of differentiated goods production away from the foreign country, but towards the home country. So a nearly 4% rise in the share of differentiated goods in the home export bundle and a corresponding fall in the foreign, an 8% rise in domestic firms, and a comparable fall in the foreign number of firms. That directly translates into a rise in home production of differentiated goods and a fall in non-differentiated goods. There's a shift in comparative advantage here. And that implies a result in which home consumption goes up and home leisure also goes up, with corresponding losses in the foreign country, and that's going to lead to significant welfare gains for the home country, which I'll show in a minute. I just wanted to show a little bit about the mechanism that's driving this. We see with inefficient stabilization in the foreign country, there's a higher markup. So they're losing competitiveness in the manufacturing sector, which is amplified by the fact those are used as inputs, amplified by the fact that then if you're importing more of your inputs, you have to pay the transportation cost, the trade cost, and that further worsens your comparative advantage in that sector. Here we see the effect on terms of trade. There's a very small gain in the manufacturing terms of trade for the home country. It actually would be a drop except for the rise in domestic wages. But if you take a look at the statistical terms of trade, which allows for this changing composition, you see a very large, like a nearly 20% rise in the terms of trade for the home country. And it's even larger if you look in terms of strategically optimal home policy. And here we show welfare. We're used to seeing fairly small numbers for welfare gains of optimal monetary policy. One of the points here is that if you're looking at cases with endogenous comparative advantage and considering equilibria that are asymmetric across countries, you can get very large welfare losses in one country, and that implies very large welfare gains for the other country that's behaving in the more optimal way. In particular, foreign welfare drops by either 2% or 5% in the unilateral optimal case. Even though they're relatively small gains for the total home plus foreign, you're getting big asymmetric effects that are offsetting each other. But from the home country's perspective, that's a big welfare gain. Okay, I think I have a little bit of time to discuss what this model has to say about optimal policy in response to a tariff shock. So let me launch into that. So this is actually coming from a separate paper, but it uses the same model. And the motivation is that given Brexit and the Trump trade wars, there's been debate over the macroeconomic effects of tariff shocks. And the existing research, at least as we saw it, focused on either real trade models or those that had a monetary dimension, assumed only very simple standard Taylor monetary rules or inflation targeting rules. And that was true also for the paper that Mick was planning to present today, but I noticed in the paper he actually presented today, he's considering optimal monetary policy. So I think we're among the only, or at least the few, papers who are actually thinking about optimal monetary policy in this context. I think that's relevant because central banks have been looking for guidance on the appropriate monetary policy response to the strange things going on in the trade world and the macroeconomic effects that they seem to have. We think that our model is particularly well suited to analyzing this question, the optimal monetary policy response to a tariff shock, because the model includes elements that the trade literature thinks are important for understanding tariff policy, that is firm entry dynamics and endogenous comparative advantage. So we had to add one thing to the model, and that was tariffs. So we simply add an ad valorem tariff that's imposed by the importing country on the price of imported differentiated goods. So it doesn't matter whether your goods prices are sticky. When the good arrives at the dock, the imported country tax on a price, whether your price is sticky or not, whether it's local or producer currency. And we specify that tariff is rebated to the households. So this does lead to a distortion in the relative prices faced by consumers. You can see in this consumption function. Yep. And again, I have some impulse responses here. First, I'm going to look at the what are the macroeconomic effects of a foreign tariff imposed on the home country under the assumption that there's no policy response for monetary policy. That is a constant money growth rule. Then I'll take a look at the optimal policy. So in this no policy case, you see a large fall in home GDP. So it's quite contractionary. And a large fall in home entry. And I'll just note that if we compare this result in our model as stands and a simpler one sector version where we got rid of that second non-differentiated goods sector, more standard macro model, the effects in this model on firm entry are 10 times the size of that in the one sector model, and the effects on GDP are 2.5 times the size. And that's because we had these reallocations between sectors going on. And I should note that reallocations between sectors is one of the key implications of tariffs that the trade literature tends to track. We do see a currency depreciation in the no policy case, but it's too small to actually offset the relative price effects of the tariff. And we do see a significant shift in comparative advantage. There's a fall in home exports of differentiated goods. That's the sector the foreign countries imposing the tariffs on. We see a rise in home production of non-differentiated goods. They're forcing us into a shift in our comparative advantage. That lowers investment in new firm creation, and actually that fall in firm creation investment is enough to reverse the effects of the tariff on the trade balance, and the home country actually starts running a trade surplus, which might be surprising. Okay, and lastly, what's the optimal policy response? And in this case, we're looking at the Ramsey policy. Our perspective we're taking is the tariff shocks are an exogenous thing imposed by policymakers that are not necessarily connected to the monetary policymaker. It might be must be viewed as a random shock as opposed to an intentional policy. Whereas the monetary policy we're viewing is what's the intelligent response to that shock. So what is the optimal response? Well, it's to engineer a large home currency depreciation, larger than you get in the no policy case. So the exchange rate, the currency depreciates even more. That leads to an expansionary policy, output rises. And it's also, yes, a rise in the number of firms. There. And one thing I want to note is that leads to significant inflation. So the response, the monetary policy response to the foreign tariff imposed on the home country is to expand to counteract that fall in GDP, and is actually inflationary. So it's quite different from the implication you would get from the inflation targeting rule that the past literatures tend to assume for monetary policy. And it's also different from a standard Taylor rule that would put a big weight on stabilizing the inflation component. You're actually amplifying or exacerbating the inflation implications, but that's what's efficient. So it's very different from a Taylor rule. Yeah, so it seems to be that rather than trying to eliminate the sticky price distortion, the policymakers here are taking advantage of the sticky price distortion in order to use the exchange rate to manipulate the relative prices and help offset the tariff distortions on the production decisions between the two sectors. Yeah, so just emphasize that this is quite different from the monetary policy rules that tend to be assumed in the macro literature trying to study the macro effects of trade policy. Okay. And just to summarize the results from this combination of this agenda, the takeaway is that monetary policy can contribute to a country's comparative advantage in trade. It actually makes a difference. So for a trade audience, it would add monetary policy to the list of the things they would take into consideration as affecting a country's comparative advantage. For the macro literature perspective, we find that it can lead to significant welfare implications that we tend not to see in the macro literature for monetary policy. And it provides a way of reconciling this disconnect within the Keynesian literature of, should we worry about competitiveness or should we worry about the terms of trade improvement? You actually should worry about both. They can be consistent with each other in a two-sector world. And lastly, I like to get the result that optimal monetary policy does have a role to play in mitigating the implications of a tariff shock once you have a model in particular that takes into consideration the effects on endogenous comparative advantage. Okay, so I will stop there.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So,
okay, can I ask a question?
Sure, please.
Paul, I think this is a really interesting model for one reason, because it gives, I'm not sure, maybe I don't really understand it properly, but there's a sense in which monetary policy can influence trade flows through kind of currency manipulation. Can you think of your model as one in which, you know, by following a particular type of monetary policy, which we could call currency manipulation, you could shift comparative advantage towards the home country? So is there a concrete way to think about currency manipulation in this model?
I think it would be an interesting extension. I think the way to view the result that we're currently getting is not so much in terms of currency manipulation, but in terms of efficient stabilization. I mean, right. you're lowering, you're gaining competitiveness because there's a lower markup. It's not that you're using the exchange rate to lower the price of your exports conditional on the shock, and conditional on other shocks, you're actually doing the opposite.
Right. Okay. So
it's not, I wouldn't view it in that normal context. Now,
can you influence the steady state terms of trade with monetary policy in your model? Like, the stochastic steady state, the mean terms of trade, is it going to be?
No, absolutely. That's what I view that as one of the main results. You are affecting the terms of trade, the unconditional means, but it's working through the shifts in shares between the two sectors in your export bundle.
Right.
So you're promoting, it's all working through promoting entry of firms. And the trade literature refers to this as the home market effect. You're creating a market that promotes firm entry and that feeds on itself, and you gain competitive advantage in that sector. What's driving the result here is different in that sense. Now, on the other hand, I think I've also looked at versions of the model that are more similar in character to what you're talking about. And tell me if this is what you're thinking. If you consider a case in which a country, as a steady state, undervalues its currency to promote a larger amount of exports.
Yeah. So that was the classic thing.
Yeah. So the trade-off there would be, I mean, you'd have to change some things in the model. One of the countries would be continually accumulating foreign reserves, continually running a current account surplus that might lead to a welfare loss in the sense that you're giving up resources by lending to the foreign country habitually. This is, on one hand, this sounds strange, but on the other hand, it's quite relevant and realistic. We can think of examples, and the potential benefit of doing this, justification for doing this. And I'm still thinking about how to write this up in the most effective way, the paper, would be that you generate this home market effect, which promotes entry of these differentiated goods, and you gain a competitive advantage in production of these higher value name brand goods over time. Is that more, that might be more similar to what you're thinking. That's not what's driving the result here, but you can get that if you suspend some elements here and allow persistent current account deficits.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else? Nobody put me the checking sign. So.
I had a question. I guess for Paul, but maybe Mick as well. So when I studied the tariffs during the Great Depression, there were actually currency wars there, which were interesting, but we didn't study. But one thing that was important for the size of the distortion of tariffs were their persistence, because we had capital accumulation, which resulted in add-on effects because they would distort long-run capital accumulation. So Paul, in your exercises, are those tariff changes, are those permanent, transitory, or what is the nature of the dynamics there?
We just slapped on a autoregressive parameter, I think of 0.9,
Okay.
and just looked at robustness. We haven't gotten to the point of studying the robustness yet. So we'd be interested in how to calibrate that.
Yeah, because a lot of this literature on the tariffs, Brexit, a lot of it's investment waiting to see what the equilibrium tariff schedule looks like, but the sense is important. So I'm glad to hear you're considering that. So
the effects of uncertainty about future tariff regime would be an additional separate effect.
Yeah.
In our calibration, we thought it was important that the tariffs, it turned out to be important that the tariffs were more persistent than the price stickiness. That implied that the exchange rate adjustment mechanism that has real effects through price stickiness can't fully offset the effects of the tariff because they die away too quickly. We thought that was relevant.
Okay, Dave, do you want to chime in, or you turned on your video? So.
Okay, so I just was sorry. I was wondering, is there kind of a Dutch disease effect here if there's productivity gains in the non-differentiated sector that implies a certain monetary policy response that impacts welfare effects?
Is this a question for me or for Mick?
Oh, for you. Sorry. So I'm looking at you in my camera, but you can't tell me that.
We haven't thought about that. I'd have to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know of any Dutch disease. So if you're for productivity gain, yeah, I think that would depend on a number of things. At least we're not picking that up in our results that we know of. But that's an interesting thing to look at.
Okay, do you want to add anything, Mick, on that?
Oh, well,
Yeah, but yeah.
yeah, we haven't really thought about the Dutch disease. So
Okay, yeah, no problem. Anybody else for Paul? Okay, so let me, I mean, we have a few minutes left. Let me ask questions. When I talk to people in the policy world or central bankers or even in the media, I have a hard time to orthogonalizing. It's not necessarily Cholesky, but orthogonalizing the currency war versus monetary policy. It seems like when your country does it, it's monetary policy. If the other country does it, it's currency war, right? So from your two papers, can we go towards have a framework or accounting framework to orthogonalize the currency manipulation versus monetary policy or stabilization policy?
well, I mean, I just I don't know what Paul would say, but I just think that it's just this kind of very popular way to describe it. I mean, when I say currency war, I put it in quotation marks because really, you know, it's a question of monetary policy. Like any macro policy has spillovers, and those spillovers can be benign or malign or very small or very large. And you know, I don't really think that. I think a lot of this currency war discussion is talking about kind of very, very small potatoes, really. I mean, and you know, even in our model, we find that the kind of welfare effects of currency wars holding trade policy constant are relatively small. But actually, when we endogenize trade policy, then that becomes a big issue. But so you know, my answer would be that the currency war is not really much of a thing. It's just that countries choose their interest rate policy for certain reasons, and there are spillovers. But you know, I don't really, I can't really think of any situation where there's, you know, countries are perversely trying to damage other countries through a war with their interest rate policy.
Paul?
One stab would be, I mean, a relevant benchmark here would be the Ramsey cooperative policy. So the currency depreciations that occur in the cases we look at are all part of a Ramsey cooperative policy. Hard to argue that that's unfair. It's just optimal stabilization. So maybe we could use that as a benchmark.
Yes, yeah, agree. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, if you do Ramsey policy from your countryside for other countries, it could be benign. I mean, Mick, you said benign or malign, but the words adjective I like more is intended versus unintended, right? Even though it's not intended on our side, other countries may look at as intended. So that's, so we can, if economists can provide a framework of how to think about them or how to orthogonalize them, I mean, I see some of those hints of the two papers we just saw today.
I was just going to suggest, I mean, so, you know, trade theory has the free trade benchmark as sort of a natural first best policy, and any deviation from that results in a terms of trade effect that benefits one and harms another, or a trade war that's gnashed to high tariffs jointly. So within monetary policy, clearly there are effects within a country that aren't symmetric as well, right? An interest rate that's high or low affects borrowers and savers differently. So I think there's a sense in which there's always a spillover. We just define it at a national boundary for some questions and not for others as well. So I think having the benchmark in terms of the, you know, what both parties would find as the first best, and then deviations from that, and then go on from there. It's probably the
Okay.
monetary policy.
Yeah.
Depends on what objective function you write down. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm getting pretty tired, guys.
Go ahead. Yeah. You want?
way past my bedtime.
Okay, so thanks, Paul. Thanks, Mick. Thanks, everybody. So thank you for joining the conference. Let me thank the two presenters as well as the previous presenters.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah, Ipe is clapping, maybe without showing his face. Okay, so this concludes the online version of this International Finance Conference. And I'd like to thank other organizers, Kwan Ho-shin, Ipe, and Dave, and Mick as well for organizing this conference. We had a hard time, but we had some constraints about this funding. So that's why we had to do it this month.
Yeah.
And also, before I close, yeah, I like to, hi, Michael. Before I close, I'd like to thank the two graduate students at Korea University, Ms. Jong-won Kim and Mr. Byung-ho Song, who answered all your emails, send you the links, and both Zoom and everything. So I'd like to thank the two students of Korea University as well. And many of you, some of you, not many, but some of you asked me about the next year's conference, and Ipe said it will be done, yeah, hopefully, yeah, done in March of 2021 in Tokyo or online. That's IFMC 6. So, do I add anything, Ipe, on that?
No, it's perfect. Yeah.
Okay. And also, some of you asked about whether, I mean, some of, especially people in the East Coast went to bed by now, and they texted me whether this conference will be available as a video later. This has been recorded, so the two graduate students will email the participants and organizers whether we agree to post it online or some parts online or not. And then if the agreed parts will be available online or will be emailed to you upon request to that email address. So we'll keep you posted on that. Okay.
Hey, thanks a lot, Janelle.
Okay,
thanks, Ipe. Thanks, Dave.
Bravo. Thanks, Moto.
Yeah, thank you.
Mario, yeah.
Thank
Michael,
you.
yeah. Taka. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.